segment to the next paper. So I want to mention that the next paper actually got the honorable mention award. So only the top 5% of the accepted paper are honorable mentions. So the author who is setting up right now is Toombs from Indiana University. And let's make sure that it shows up. Yes, that's good. Okay, so I'm going to present the certificate of the honorable mention award. Congratulations.
Thank you. Is that okay? Can you hear me?
Okay.
All right. 안녕하세요. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our talk, The Proper Care and Feeding of Hackerspaces, Care Ethics and Cultures of Making. I'm Toombs, a PhD candidate from Indiana University, Bloomington, and I work with Shaowen Bardzell and Jeffrey Bardzell in the Cultural Research and Technology group at Indiana University. In this talk, we will motivate how care ethics can be used as a productive lens to understand DIY and maker culture. Specifically, we argue that much of the research in HCI on makers is implicitly focused on individual makers and their skills. This focus is in line with the often espoused libertarian ideologies of rugged individualism and distrust of centralized authority that are prevalent in these spaces, but it does not account for the everyday, mundane interactions that are required of such communities to be sustained. We show how our care ethics lens can help provide a fuller understanding of the social environment of these hackerspaces through an investigation of community maintenance work. I'll first introduce and define care ethics. Then I'll provide the details of our research approach and introduce the field site. Following that, I will demonstrate that the hackerspace we study relies on care for community involvement and engagement. And I will summarize the conclusions for this and HCI work more broadly. Care ethics is a moral theory that was introduced by cognitive and developmental psychologist Carol Gilligan as a response to Kohlberg's theory of moral development. Gilligan argued that Kohlberg's theory implicitly supported the abstract and universalized principles of justice towards which men were socialized. She and other authors then presented care ethics with its focus on particular contexts and the interdependence of people as an alternative to this justice ethics. In some modern uses, care ethics is moving beyond these universal versus particularistic, justice versus care, and masculine versus feminine dichotomies. The work we build on in this talk engages instead with the ethical, moral, and value implications of the practice of care, which range from the focus of political policy implications to the maintenance of personal relationships. The study of care and care ethics is increasingly becoming part of HCI research discourse. For some examples, De La Bella advocates for an ethos of care in STS research. Light and Akama believe that because designers' work is of an interventionist nature, they have a responsibility as custodians of care in participatory design research. And Shaowen Bardzell argues for a care ethics-based, emancipatory, and utopian view of participatory design and ubiquitous computing. Each of these framings provides a possible inroad for the use of care ethics in informing how we conduct HCI research and design work. Following and expanding on this prior work, we argue that a care ethics lens helps us understand the often neglected maintenance work and care labor needed to run and support maker communities. In our work, we define community maintenance labor as anything that's teleologically oriented toward the success of the hackerspace as a social group. This includes not just the mundane work of like taking out the trash or keeping the space clean, but also the emotional labor of dealing with other individuals and perpetuating a desirable atmosphere. By analyzing community maintenance practices through a lens of care, we saw that in performing this work, hackerspace members try to balance between two extremes, being rational hackers who are rule and contract driven, and being interdependent community members who can recognize and respond to the particular needs of other members. The maintenance work we analyzed comes from a 19-month ethnography we conducted in a Midwestern college town hackerspace we call Null Alpha, where we also participated as members. Null Alpha began as a tool and knowledge sharing group in a member's basement, and it has since expanded several times as they have acquired more space, more tools, and more members. At the beginning of the ethnography, Null Alpha was expanding its member base dramatically, which allowed us to observe how new members were learning how to become a part of this community and how to adopt their particular version of a hacker identity. Throughout these observations, there were around 30 dues-paying members, though that fluctuated, and there were a handful of regular visitors. All of our participants happened to be Caucasian, between 19 and 50 years of age, and only 3 of these participants were female, one of whom was a founding member. Observations took place on-site and anywhere that there were events, resulting in around 250 hours of direct contact with participants, over 15 hours of targeted interviews, and data in the form of field notes, jottings, photos, and recordings. During these observations, we focused not just on their technical achievements and their individual skills, but also on how they operate as a community, which led us to our eventual interest in community maintenance labor because it seemed so at odds with the libertarian hacker ethic that they often referenced. So having introduced the research methodology in the field site, I'd like to talk through how care is empirically enacted in null alpha using the typology of care developed by methodologist and critical feminist ethnographer Barbara Dennis, who's formerly known as Korth. I'll go through each of these in turn, but briefly, Korth's 3-part typology of care categorizes actions into overt-explicit, overt-implicit, and covert-implicit care. And it's important to note that what's primarily of interest here is not the content of the care, but how the care is conveyed to other people. An example of overt-explicit care is when you hold the door open for someone else, and that person responds with some kind of thank you, a smile, a nod, or a verbal thank you. This kind of care is recognizable by the other participants present for its enactment, and it's responded to as an act of care. In the hackerspace, overt-explicit care took the form of donating personal resources, teaching others how to use tools, and rewarding individuals for doing care or maintenance work. Andrew, for example, takes pride in being able to teach people new skills. He says, "I really like to see someone be able to work on their own after I've helped them. I'm very glad that I've been able to be helpful to a lot of people in a lot of different areas." In this space, overt-explicit care is acceptable when it's motivated by a desire to teach, to learn, or to participate in activities that directly benefit the community, especially if they're helping others on their journey to autonomy. An example of overt-implicit care might include joking with a loved one after an argument to show that you're sorry without actually apologizing, or perhaps laughing at presenters' jokes when they aren't very funny. This kind of care is recognizable as care, but the fact that it's intended to be caring is not the focus of the interaction. This type of care is most evident in the hackerspace in how the community is structured to help members feel a legitimate stake in the social group. They do this by investing a lot of energy into the flat hierarchy structure of the group, and they are proud that they still operate as a consensus organization, where all the members have an equal say in how the space is used. In this quote, you can see how Karen and Mike, who are 2 members of the board of this community, explain how difficult it is to run a consensus organization to Ben, who's another member. Although it's not hard to find instances when some members really do have more power than others, they try really hard to sustain this egalitarian atmosphere throughout. The fact that this organization operates as a flat structure is explicit, but the care made possible through this structure is implicit. Through it, board members try to create a welcoming atmosphere and solidify a feeling of belonging to other members. Other such overt implicit acts of care that help members feel like they belong include complimenting or legitimating another's projects, usually by calling it badass or a proper hack or something like that. Even without even these bland encouragements, it would be easy to become self-critical of one's projects and start to disconnect from the community. These caring acts would be less effective if they were done more explicitly. It would feel insincere or even creepy if you went up to somebody visiting the space and said, "I'm going to show you around the space now so that you feel comfortable here." Covert implicit care describes acts that would lose their effectiveness completely if they were recognized as care by the recipient. A good example of this is letting a child win at a game of basketball. Other people watching the game might know that it's care, but for the child to recognize that they're being cared for in this way would completely make the interaction fall apart. Interpersonal care, or care that addresses the subjective state or identity concerns of other members, was primarily covert and implicit in this way. In an interview, Justin told me, "I've been impressed, and this has come to mind a couple of times, with how many questions I'm able to ask, and some of them seem very, very simple, and I've yet to have someone look at me and say, 'You don't know what that is?'" The covert implicit care we saw in the space often worked toward fostering an atmosphere where members could feel safe being vulnerable and exposing the weaknesses and gaps in their knowledge, precisely by not calling attention to these vulnerabilities. These acts are often employed to reassert and establish the maker identity claims of other members. Similar examples of this include how members would downplay their own expertise while helping others in order to make the others feel more at ease. Several of the board members use this technique quite often to make visitors and newer members feel like they are more approachable. What I've shown so far is a range of caring actions that we observed in this particular hackerspace. When we then analyze this range of caring actions, looking for what kinds of care can be overt or explicit and what kinds of care have to be covert or implicit, we can see how some of these caring actions exist in a tension with the libertarian ideology that is often espoused in the same community. Anything that helps others acquire new maker or DIY skills can be foregrounded in the conversation, and it's easy to see these actions as expressions of a sort of hacker ethic, as they were often explicitly framed as helping others become more independent. Addressing another member's identity as a maker or their emotional needs to connect with those who have similar interests without feeling vulnerable is usually done in a more roundabout fashion, such as through sarcasm, veiled detachment, or constructed teaching scenarios. But we would argue that these ideals of interdependence, support, and community are equally as constitutive of the hacker identity in this group as the other more overtly libertarian ideals are. Our exploration of this maintenance work has begun to reveal that the ethos in place at this particular hackerspace, and likely others, is a negotiated ethos that complexly includes both this espoused hacker ideal of individualism and independence that underlies their self-image as hackers, and the hidden yet enacted care ethic ideals of interdependence, support, and community. Except that this second set of values are not being explicitly reproduced the way that the values of autonomy and independence are. This is the tension I referenced earlier about being a rational hacker and being an interdependent community member. As an example of how this everyday tension plays out in practice, I'll talk a little bit about how this space is introduced to visitors. As in many other hackerspaces, the members of Null Alpha are quick to tell visitors that anyone can be a maker. And this promise is backed up by a number of tactics members take on, including their willingness to help visitors, their patience in the face of simple questions, and the board members' habits of playing down their own expertise to build up the confidence of less experienced members. In many ways, these are all tactics of care, yet this can also be read as a hacker ethos appropriating care. One reason is that these acts of care support the health of Null Alpha as an organization that requires monetary support to survive. These care tactics are good for business because they encourage people to visit regularly and eventually become dues-paying members. Because of this, there's a sort of pressure when it comes to showing visitors around. Should members be honest that most of what they do is socialized in this space? Or should they show visitors all of the flashy tools that the space has and hope that the visitors buy into that premise instead? Even though current members, for the most part, recognize the importance of the socialization that goes on within the space, it's much easier to convince prospective members that joining is worth their money because of what the space empowers them to do. More deeply than this, however, is that this anyone can be a maker rhetoric obscures those who systematically cannot become makers in the way that making is described in this community. Anyone here refers particularly to a certain set of certain social class of people who have enough free time, resources, and transportation means to join this group. This failure to address systemic issues when considering who is excluded from participating extends to issues of diversity and equality as well. When the poor representation of women in Null Alpha comes up in their member meetings, the members agree that the policy, "Our door is always open to anyone who wants to come," is sufficient. The official stance then is that for everyone to feel welcomed, they should all be treated exactly the same. This is demonstrative of a libertarian stance towards equality that involves assuming a universalized, abstracted position towards such social and systemic issues. Or, in other words, a blindness towards gender and gender expression, race, sexual orientation, and other differences. The members clearly hope that they can individually convince underrepresented participants who self-select into their space, but for every such participant who does show up, how many don't show up at all? What we see here is an example of how care can be subordinated to or in service of the more traditional hacker ethos. To wrap up here, we saw how care ethics can be used to explore the nature and significance of maintenance work within maker and DIY communities. Care ethics enabled us to step outside of the espoused community framings and ideologies hackerspaces use to disguise how interpersonal care is as important to the maker identity as any other key component. Our exploration in particular has begun to reveal the ethic in place at this space, and likely others, as a negotiated ethic that complexly includes both the espoused libertarian ideals of individualism and the hidden yet enacted care ethic ideals of interdependence, support, and community. And extending more broadly, current literature on making cultures often discusses how the barrier of entry to these communities and practices can be lowered. It is easy to conceive of this barrier as comprising knowledge or skill requirements, or difficulty understanding or figuring out how to physically get started in these spaces. And this assumption is mirrored in the hackerspace itself. But it's more difficult, or perhaps more accurate, to conceive of these barriers as sociological. A care ethics lens reveals that these barriers are likely less about individual skills and more about the social environment of the community and the interpersonal differences of those within it. More broadly, care ethics can build on feminist approaches within the HCI research community to provide a fuller understanding of the social environment of hackerspaces through an investigation of this community maintenance work. With that, I want to thank several people and our reviewers for the critiques of this paper, as well as the NSF and Intel ISTC for Social Computing program for their support of this work. And above all, I want to thank you all for listening.
Hey, hi, I'm Marketa from National University Singapore. I really like your talk. I really like the idea of care and the three categorization. I was just wondering if you ever looked at the possible differences between different geopolitical contexts. Like if you look, for example, at the hackerspaces in Indonesia, it's not so much libertarianism as a communitarism, so the care is much more explicit and very natural in the everyday behavior. So I was just wondering, if you was thinking about it, how to apply the care model on different geopolitical contexts. It would be really interesting, I think.
I agree. I think that would be incredibly interesting. What we presented here was an ethnography of this one particular hackerspace, but it would be awesome if you wanted to go study a hackerspace in Indonesia and do something similar, and then we could compare notes. I think that would be amazing.
That would be really amazing. Yeah. So, okay, thanks for it.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Nick from Stanford University. This idea of the libertarian kind of ethos that a lot of hackers have, did you look at all into sort of what people's self-identity is and the self in relation to who they are as a hacker versus who they are as a community member, and maybe how that grows over their time as they enter the community? Because you mentioned that people come in, and I could imagine this very libertarian, I want to be on my own and kind of thing. But as they become a member of the community, they actually implicitly start taking on these care ethics.
Oh, yeah, definitely. That's a really good question. There's one member in particular that I'm thinking of that really exemplifies this, where he joined this hackerspace primarily because he wanted to be able to eventually detach himself from the electrical grid. And so he wanted to learn how to do a bunch of different things so that he could be independent and he could self-power his house. And he eventually was able to do that, but then he also eventually became one of the main members who would organize how other members in the community could clean the space together or could keep the space all maintained or organized within it. And so it sort of sent these different messages of wanting to be a hermit and also wanting to interact with everybody all the time.
And just as a quick follow-up, did you find that he was aware of that, or is this something that you observed in him?
So what this idea of adopting this libertarian ethos isn't necessarily something that somebody would say, I am 100% full-time hardcore libertarian and I'm going to not ever interact with anybody ever again. It's not that. It's when we talk about the libertarian ethos, what we're primarily talking about is how different avenues that often talk about maker culture express this more explicitly. There's of course this idea that everybody can work together, or that you can still work together and and adopt this sort of maker ethic, but this actual interrelatedness between people isn't what's made explicit. It's this other independent sort of rhetoric.
Great.
I don't know if that answered your question. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you.